This morning we're going to be in Gospel of Mark chapter 9. This being Father's Day, we're going to look at one of the miracles of Jesus involving that of a father. There was an old Nazarene evangelist by the name of Bud Robinson. He is reported to have prayed the following prayer each day. He prayed, "O Lord, give me a backbone as big as a saw log and ribs like the sleepers under the church floor. Put iron shoes on my feet and galvanized breeches on my body. Give me rhinoceros hide for skin and hang up a wagon load of determination in the gable end of my soul. Help me to sign the contract to fight the devil as long as I've got a tooth, and then to gum him till I die." That's what you call a prayer of faith. You know, as a Christian, faith is key to all that we do. In fact, our Christian journey began in faith. We live each day in faith. And it will end in our faith turning to sight when we meet our Savior face to face. It is our faith in God that allows us to live a Christ-like life and to survive the struggles and the storms of life. In this passage that we're looking at today, first the disciples and then Jesus had one of those fights with the devil that old Bud Robinson talked about in his prayer. The disciples end up learning a great lesson about faith. That is, prayer is the avenue to the true power of faith, which is found in Christ Jesus. Let's begin reading in verse 14. It says, "And when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them, and scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed, and ran up to meet him and greeted them. And he said to them, 'What are you arguing about with them?' And someone from the crowd answered him, 'Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able.'" The disciples encounter a situation of a demon-possessed boy whose father wanted the demon cast out, and they were not able. The first lesson that we find in this account is that mountaintop experiences are often followed by the lowliness of the valley, which requires a great faith. You see, Jesus had just taken Peter, James, and John up on the mountain. And there he was transformed before them. Jesus had given the disciples a small glimpse of the glory of God. This was probably done as a way of Jesus giving the disciples a glimpse of what would eventually happen with him, because Jesus would soon suffer and die and then be resurrected and then glorified as he returned to heaven. In fact, it was such a great experience that Peter wanted to build 3 tents, one for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, so that they could just stay there. But as Peter found out, you cannot live on the mountain. A short time later, they came down from the mountain. And when they came down and they saw the rest of the disciples, they found them in an argument with the scribes, who were experts in the Old Testament law. And it says, when the crowd saw him, they were amazed. Why were they amazed when they saw Jesus? Well, that word amazed is the same word that is used to describe the deep distress of Jesus when he was in Gethsemane praying. Here it means a trembling astonishment that verges on alarm. The reason they were amazed, surprised, shocked to see Jesus is because more than likely Jesus was still showing some lingering effects of that transfiguration on the mountain. It could very well be that Jesus still had a little bit of that glory of God shining on his face when he came down off of that mountain. Jesus still had a little bit of a glow to him. So when Jesus asked about the argument, a man approaches from the crowd, tells him he had a son that was demon-possessed. And that demon terrorized his son. And the man came to the disciples to have the demon cast out, and they were unable to do it. Boy, welcome back to the valley, Jesus. He had just been on the mountain and had that glorious experience. And he comes down off of the mountain to find his disciples in failure. So often, we have those great spiritual experiences. And it's not long before we are shaken back to reality by the trials and the problems of the valley. You remember Moses had that experience. He was up on the mountain. God had given him the law. And in fact, before Moses left from the mountain, he had that argument with God. And he would not leave until God showed him his glory. So God showed Moses a bit of his glory. So Moses had this incredible experience. He comes down off of the mountain, and what does he find? He finds his right-hand man leading the people in idol worship of a golden calf. There have been those times as a pastor when God has done a great work in the church, and it came crashing to an end by the problems of the valley. I know one time a church where I pastored, God had just been doing an incredible work in the church. I mean, we had experienced great growth. Things were awesome. And before long, it crashed and ended when a group in the church decided to start a mess. We find that even Jesus returned from the mountain to have to deal with the mess of the disciples. You see, the mountaintop experience can't last forever, as much as we would love for it to do so. You will return to the valley at some point. But it's often those mountaintop experiences that carry us through the despair of the valley. The mountaintop experiences often strengthens our faith. It builds us up and enables us to live that life in the valley. Well, what about the power for faith? Where does the power for faith come from? Well, the power for faith comes through Jesus. Let's pick up in verse 19. And Jesus answered them, and he said, O faithless generation, how long am I going to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me. And they brought the boy to him. And when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, from childhood, and it has often cast him into the fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for the one who believes. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, help my unbelief. Jesus responded to the failure of the disciples with some very condemning words. He said, oh, you unbelieving generation, how long am I going to be with you? How long do I have to keep putting up with you? You see, the disciples had been with Jesus for miracle after miracle after miracle. Jesus had taught them how to pray. He had taught them how to depend on him. He taught them about faith. Yet when the critical time came, they failed. The whole point of this story is the need for greater faith. The words of Jesus point that out. Also, his discussion with the Father about faith, his private teaching of the disciples later on, all bear out the need for greater faith. The questions of Jesus are expressions of frustration at stubborn and persistent unbelief. Jesus then has a discussion with the Father about the history of the Son's demon possession. He finds out that this had happened since childhood. For many years, the Son had been terrorized by a demon. I don't know where you stand as far as demons, demon possession. I will tell you it's a real thing. It's very real. I have seen it twice in my life. Many years ago, in a church where I was not pastor or anything. It's before that. I'll never forget, as we were singing worship songs, there was a lady that was just a beautiful young lady. Very quiet, very shy. Hardly said anything. When she did, she spoke in a soft voice. And all of a sudden you heard this horrid shrieking sound just pierce through the air. Turned around and it was her. And it was demon possession. And some of the men got her out and prayed over her. Then I encountered it again later on as we prayed for a lady. But folks, it's real. Listen, when you read these things in the Bible, don't just think, well, you know, that happened back in the Bible. Listen, it's real. Satan is alive and well. And his angels are alive and well. It happens. But there's no doubt this father and this son had a very desperate need. Well, then the father ends by saying to Jesus, but if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. That word compassion describes the innermost, deepest feelings and emotions. Compassion means to literally feel the hurt of another person. Let me say this, though. It takes both compassion and help. Okay? Let me explain to you what I mean. You can feel compassion for a person, but not help them. Or you can have the ability to help a person, but not have the compassion to do anything for them. It takes both. I say that because it's not enough just to have compassion. It's not enough to tell someone, oh, I'm sorry you lost a loved one. It's not enough to tell somebody, I'm sorry you're having a tough time. And by the way, it's not enough to tell them, I'm praying for you. I'm amazed when I look on social media sometime. Somebody will put something out there, that something they're really struggling with, some hurt in their life, and all of a sudden you see all these comments, praying for you, praying for you, praying for you. I'm like, probably 99 out of 100 people don't even think about that again. I mean, don't put out there you're praying for them if you're not. I remember years ago when I was in college, in a counseling class, I sat next to one of the cheerleaders for the school. She was a tiny little thing, And I can remember her telling me, because in that class we actually had to counsel one another. She looked over me and she said to me, I'm going to tell you something. When it comes my time somebody's counseling me, she said, if they tell me, well, I'm praying for you, she said, I'm going to deck them. I thought, well, that's about what they need. But I say that, folks, because listen, this is something we all need to work on. We live in a society today that thinks it's enough to have compassion for someone, to tell them, I'm sorry you lost, I'm sorry this happened, I'm sorry you're going through this. That's good. But as a Christian, as a child of God, you need to help. They need help. They don't just need your words. They need help. Don't you remember back in the old days in church, probably with your parents, when a family had a death, ladies would go over and they would clean the house, and the men would get together and they would do anything that's needed, mow the yard, whatever, get things taken care of, food delivered to the house, meal after meal. Remember those days? Maybe we need to get back to that. Maybe we need to put a little help with our compassion. Well, obviously the faith of the Father had been shattered. The disciples were unable to cast this demon out. So Jesus responds to the Father when the Father says to him, if you can do anything, would you have compassion on us and help us? And Jesus responded to him, if you can, all things are possible for the one who believes. The issue is not Jesus' ability, but a willingness on the Father's part to respond in faith. Don't misunderstand and think that if you have enough faith, you can do anything. Okay? It's not necessarily the amount of faith. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Many years ago I went through some very horrid medical experiences. I had a lady tell me sometime after that, one of my dear church members, she came up to me and told me, she said, if you had enough faith, you'd be healed. I didn't hit her. I promise I didn't hit her. But it's not necessarily the amount of faith. Whether or not one is healed or helped or whatever, it's not determined by how much faith that person has. It's not the amount, but the object of that faith that's important. what is that faith in? Is that faith in God? Or is that faith in themselves? Or is that faith in some other person? What is the object of that faith? You know, at the end of Matthew's gospel, when you read this story in Matthew's gospel, at the end, Jesus tells the disciples, if you have faith as the grain of a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, be cast into the sea, and it will be done. Jesus said you just got to have a little bit of faith, and you can move a mountain. How can that be done? How is that possible? Because that faith is in the sovereign Lord of the universe. It is the power of God that gives faith its power. You see, God takes over when people let go and put their trust in Him. So the man realizes his own faith is wavering, and so he cries out to Jesus, I believe, help my unbelief. That help my unbelief is a recognition that his humanity is still weak, and that only in the power of God will he be sufficient in his faith. That is also an act of faith, since calling on God for greater faith is trusting in Him rather than in ourselves. The essence of true faith. That needs to become our cry today. Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. True faith is always aware how small and inadequate it is. The father becomes a believer not when he amasses this great amount of faith, but when he risks everything on what little faith he has, when he yields his insufficiency to the sufficiency of Jesus Christ. True faith takes no confidence in itself. It looks to the more powerful one, who stands in the place of God, whose authoritative word restores life from chaos. True faith is unconditional openness to God, a decision in the face of all to the contrary that Jesus is able. Do you realize how incredible it is what Jesus said? All things are possible for him who believes. I wonder how often the Lord becomes exasperated at our unbelief. How often does Jesus say to us, you unbelieving people, how long am I going to have to put up with you? What we need to do is put our faith in the power of God and quit trusting in ourselves. We need to take Jesus at His word, that all things are possible for the one who believes. There's no limit to what can be done when we trust in the power of God. Look at that. Jesus said all things are possible. Nothing is excluded. He didn't say all things except. He said all things possible. We also find that prayer is the path to faith. Look in verse 25. And when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand, lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer." Jesus took the boy and commanded the spirit to come out of him and never enter him again. The demon came out and apparently left the boy dead. Now understand, the language here is that of a resurrection. This literally reads, Jesus raised him and resurrected him. The power of Jesus, listen, the power of Jesus is a resurrection power. It is the power that can bring life from death. It is resurrection power. Well, the episode concludes with the discussion between Jesus and the disciples. They want to know why they couldn't cast the demon out. Why couldn't they do it? I mean, keep in mind, Jesus had already given them the authority to cast out demons. And in fact, they had already cast out a demon on a previous occasion. Jesus responds to them, "This kind comes out only by prayer." What happened to the issue of faith? We've been talking about faith the whole time. What happened to faith? Listen, prayer is more than just talking to God. Okay? It is acknowledging our dependence on Him for all our needs. Apparently, the disciples thought their authority came from their own status as disciples of Jesus, or maybe the techniques that they learned from Him. You see, sometimes being successful is one of our worst enemies. Because when we're successful, we get this idea that we can just do it again and again and again and again. Well, the disciples perhaps had that attitude. And Jesus reminded them that they had no power on their own. It is only by faith through prayer that one can tap into the infinite, almighty power of God. Doing the work of Christ is characterized by a constant awareness of our inadequacy as a servant. As this story illustrates, Jesus will call you to task beyond your ability. God will call you to do some things that are beyond your ability. The power to do that comes from Him, not yourself. The fact that the work surpasses your abilities is evidence that that ministry is of Christ. It's not of you. It has nothing to do about you. It's all about God. The disciples learned a valuable lesson. A great faith comes only by Christ connecting prayer. There's going to be times when we come off the mountain in our lives. We've had that great spiritual experience. Something incredible has happened and we're all excited. We're praising God. And when we come off that mountain, we're going to find that we come crashing down into the valley of service. But listen, it's not the mountaintop but the valley where a Christian's primary occupation of service resides. It's in the valley where we do our work. There will be those times when your faith is shaken. It is then that we must cry out to Jesus and say to him, Lord, help my unbelief. It's not the amount of our faith so much, but that we put our faith in the one who can, the one who is able. We must trust in God through whom all things are possible. We must risk everything we have and put our insufficiency into the sufficiency of Christ. We must always remember that prayer connects us to power. Prayer is the avenue to power that makes faith go. We must always remember that it's not our ability, not our resources, and not our past successes that allows us to do great things. It is our belief in the Lord Jesus Christ that makes all things possible. You may be in a situation today where you need a great faith. Something's happened in your life. You need a great faith. Life has you down. You're facing a situation that just seems impossible. You have a desperate need like the father in this story. You need a touch of Jesus. He's the one that can meet your need. Remember, it's not a great faith we need, but faith in a great God that we need. You may be here today and realize my faith is weak. I'm struggling in my faith. Then put your faith in Jesus Christ. Make sure your faith is anchored in Him, because it is through Him that all things are possible. You need a miracle in your life? You need something great to happen? Jesus Christ is the one who can. He's the one that is able. Just a moment as we have a time of commitment, I invite you today to respond to the call of God in your life. You may need a greater faith. God can provide that. You may have a great need in your life. You're struggling, something's going on in your life today. God can meet that need. We have our time of commitment. I invite you to come. I'll be here at the front to meet you, to help you in any way that I can. Our altars are open if you'd like to just come and pray. This morning, let God have His way in your life. Connect to Him today. Stop relying on yourself or relying on others, and rely upon Him.